"Sir, I don't care what medals you have. Without proper ID, you're going to have to go to the back of the line and start over." The fluorescent lights of the DMV buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow across the linoleum floor. It was 4:30 p.m. on a Friday, and the air hung heavy with collective frustration. 23 people stood in various lines, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, checking watches, and scrolling mindlessly through phones. Thomas Henderson stood quietly at counter number 3. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he placed his expired driver's license and tattered military ID on the counter. At 68, he wasn't as steady as he once was, especially after standing in line for nearly 2 hours. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite the summer heat, he wore a pressed button-down shirt tucked into belted slacks. A small limp was evident as he had shifted his weight to his good leg. "As I explained," he said softly, "my house fire last month destroyed most of my documents. I have my military ID here and my expired license. I just need—" The clerk cut him off with a dismissive wave. Her nameplate read, "Karen Wilcox, Supervisor." She pushed his documents back across the counter without even looking at them properly. "Our policy is clear. We need 2 current forms of ID, not expired ones. Military ID doesn't count for license renewal without supporting documentation." Her voice carried across the no-quieting room. Several people in nearby lines glanced over. Thomas cleared his throat. "Ma'am, according to state law, veterans with service-connected disabilities are eligible for—" "Sir," Karen's voice rose sharply, "we have procedures here. I don't make exceptions based on stories about house fires or old military service." She gestured toward the back of the room. "You'll need to start over with the proper documentation or come back another day. There are people waiting." A murmur rippled through the crowded office. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. One younger man in line started to speak up, but thought better of it when Karen shot him a warning look. Thomas stood motionless, his face betraying no emotion, though his knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped his cane. He carefully gathered his rejected documents, tucking them into an inside pocket of his jacket. The small purple heart pin on his lapel caught the fluorescent light briefly. "I understand," he said quietly. "May I use your phone?" Karen pointed to a pay phone near the restrooms. "Make it quick. We close in 30 minutes. Thomas nodded and slowly made his way across the room, the soft tap of his cane marking each careful step. The conversations throughout the DMV had dropped to whispers, the atmosphere thick with tension as the clock ticked toward closing time. Thomas Henderson had never been one to draw attention to himself. At 68, his 6-foot frame now carried a slight stoop, the result of both age and the shrapnel still embedded in his lower back. 37 years had passed since he'd earned his Purple Heart in the mountains of Afghanistan, but the memories remained as sharp as the pain that still woke him on cold mornings. The limp was worse today after standing so long. His doctor had recommended a wheelchair, but Thomas refused, not out of pride, but practicality. His modest one-bedroom apartment, the only place he could afford after the fire, had doorways too narrow for a standard wheelchair. The cane was a compromise, just like so many things in his life since Margaret passed 8 months ago. Few would guess that the unassuming elderly man in the faded blue button-down shirt and carefully pressed slacks had once led a Marine Corps reconnaissance unit through some of the most dangerous territories in modern warfare. His silver hair was cut short in a style that never quite abandoned military regulations, and his posture, despite the pain, maintained a certain dignity. The small Purple Heart pin on his lapel was his only visible connection to those years, a quiet reminder more for himself than others. 3 weeks ago, the electrical fire had taken what remained of his and Margaret's life together. Insurance would eventually help, but bureaucracy moved slowly. What he needed now was his driver's license. Without it, he couldn't access his VA benefits at the new facility, couldn't get his medication refilled, couldn't begin rebuilding his life. Karen Wilcox watched Thomas through narrowed eyes as he made his phone call. At 34, she'd worked at the DMV for 11 years and had been supervisor for 3. The government laminate badge hanging around her neck was positioned precisely at the center of her crisp blouse, the matching navy blazer a personal touch to the standard dress code. Karen took pride in running the most efficient DMV office in the county, a fact she mentioned in every performance review. The lines, the procedures, the rules, they all existed for a reason. Her father had taught her that structure was the foundation of society before he'd left when she was 12. The memory made her straighten the already straight stack of forms on her counter. People like this old man were always looking for special treatment, always had some story, some excuse. It slowed everything down, created exceptions others would demand. Rules were rules. 5 minutes to closing, she announced loudly, taking satisfaction in the collective sigh from those still waiting. Anyone not already being served will need to return tomorrow. Comment respect if you believe our veterans deserve better than this treatment at government offices. Thomas returned from the pay phone with a renewed sense of calm. He settled into one of the hard plastic chairs in the waiting area, his cane propped against his knee. The exodus had begun. Those unfortunate enough to be caught in the closing time announcement were reluctantly filing out, some casting sympathetic glances his way. A young man in his 20s approached Thomas, lowering his voice. "Sir, that wasn't right, how she treated you. My grandpa was in Vietnam. I just wanted to say, it's fine, son," Thomas replied with a small smile. "But thank you." Karen watched the interaction with thinning patience. She finished with her current customer and called out across the now half-empty room. "Sir, I thought I made myself clear. We're closing." Thomas nodded politely. "I understand, ma'am. I'm just waiting for someone." Karen's jaw tightened as she processed the remaining customers. 28 years in the Marines had taught Thomas to read people. The supervisor was someone who needed control, who found comfort in rules and procedures. He'd known many officers like her. Some eventually learned that regulations existed to serve people, not the other way around. Others never did. "Sir," Karen approached, her heels clicking sharply across the linoleum. "The office closes at 5. You need to leave." "I served this country for nearly 3 decades, Thomas said quietly. "Spent 2 years in a military hospital. All I'm asking is some consideration while I get my documents in order after losing my home." "Everyone has a story," Karen replied, folding her arms. "But DMV policy is clear. Come back when you have the proper documentation." A middle-aged woman still waiting in line spoke up. "Can't you make an exception? The man has a Purple Heart, for goodness sake." Karen swiveled toward the new voice. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules. And how do we even know that PIN is real? Anyone can buy military memorabilia online these days." Thomas's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes darkened. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, worn leather wallet. From it, he carefully removed a creased photograph and held it out. "This is the only picture I have left after the fire. Khost Province, Afghanistan, 2002. Those 18 men came home because of decisions I made that day. 3 others didn't. I earned this pin, Ms. Wilcox." Karen barely glanced at the photo. "Sir, your military service, while appreciated, doesn't exempt you from standard identification requirements." The remaining customers had gone silent, watching the exchange. One of the other clerks, a middle-aged woman, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I've already called the regional VA office," Thomas explained calmly. "They're sending someone over with documentation that should satisfy your requirements. I'd appreciate being allowed to wait." Karen checked her watch dramatically. "We close in 15 minutes. If they're not here by then, you'll have to come back tomorrow." She walked away before Thomas could respond. The other clerk approached Karen at her station, speaking in a hushed voice. "Karen, I think that's really Thomas Henderson. Wasn't he written up in that Veterans Recognition Bulletin last month? The one about local heroes." "I don't care if he's Captain America," Karen hissed back. "Rules are rules." The minutes ticked by. 5 o'clock arrived. Karen made a show of checking her watch again and walked over to where Thomas sat patiently. "It's 5 o'clock. We're closed now. You'll need to leave." Thomas slowly rose to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "They'll be here any minute." "Security," Karen called to the uniformed guard by the door. "Please escort this gentleman out. We're closed." The guard, a heavy-set man in his 50s, approached reluctantly. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to leave the premises." Thomas looked at him steadily. "Son, I understand you have a job to do. But I made a call, and help is coming. I'd suggest we all wait just a few minutes more." Karen stepped between them. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling the police if you don't leave immediately." Thomas didn't move. "That won't be necessary," he said quietly. "Someone else is already on their way." The roar of engines outside broke the tense standoff. Through the large front windows of the DMV, a convoy of sleek black government SUVs screeched to a halt in the parking lot, emergency lights flashing. 4 vehicles formed a perimeter while a fifth, longer than the others, stopped directly in front of the entrance. Karen's mouth fell open. What in the world? The security guard moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. Ma'am, those are government plates. Military and federal. The remaining DMV employees gathered at the windows as uniformed military personnel emerged from the vehicles. Two Marines in dress blues took positions at either side of the main entrance. A third opened the door of the center SUV, and a tall figure stepped out. That's Director Montgomery, whispered one of the clerks. From the Pentagon. I saw him on the news last week. James Montgomery, Director of Veterans Affairs and retired four-star general, cut an imposing figure even in his 60s. His uniform, adorned with rows of decorations and 4 silver stars, was immaculate. His aide-de-camp, a sharp-featured lieutenant colonel, flanked him on the right, while 2 security personnel in plain clothes, but with visible earpieces, took positions behind. The doors of the DMV swung open. Director Montgomery entered, removing his cap as he crossed the threshold. His eyes scanned the room, immediately finding Thomas Henderson. What happened next stunned everyone present. The director, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Pentagon, came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. Staff Sergeant Henderson, sir. It's an honor to meet you in person. Thomas, with considerable effort, rose to his feet and returned the salute. The director strode forward and clasped Thomas's hand firmly. The VA regional director called me directly when you reached out. I apologize for the delay. I was across town at a meeting with the governor. Karen stood frozen, her face draining of color as the director turned toward her. Ma'am, I presume you're the supervisor who's been assisting Staff Sergeant Henderson? The words assisting carried an unmistakable edge. Ah, yes, sir. Karen Wilcox, senior supervisor. The director nodded crisply. Ms. Wilcox, are you familiar with Federal Code Title 38, Section 1718, regarding expedited services for combat wounded veterans? We have our state procedures that. Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery addressed his aide without taking his eyes off Karen. Please initiate a full compliance audit of this facility, effective immediately. Yes, sir. The officer produced a tablet and began tapping on it. Director Montgomery addressed the room. Attention everyone. I am Director James Montgomery, Department of Veterans Affairs. By authority vested in me through Executive Order 13822, I am temporarily assuming operational control of this facility. He turned to Thomas. Staff Sergeant Henderson, for those here who may not be aware, is one of the most decorated combat veterans in this state. During Operation Enduring Freedom, Sergeant Henderson's reconnaissance unit came under heavy enemy fire and caused province. The director's voice carried throughout the now silent office. When their position was compromised, Sergeant Henderson personally led a counterattack that saved 18 American lives. Despite sustaining severe shrapnel wounds to his back and legs, he carried 2 wounded Marines to safety before returning under fire to recover a fallen comrade. Montgomery placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. The man standing before you refused evacuation until all his men were accounted for. He spent 27 months in Walter Reed learning to walk again. His actions that day are still taught at Quantico as an example of battlefield leadership. Karen's face had gone from white to crimson. One of the military personnel approached the director and whispered something in his ear. I see, Montgomery said, then addressed the DMV staff again. I've just been informed that no one in this office has completed the federally mandated training on veterans service accommodations, despite receiving notification 6 months ago. He turned to his aide. Colonel, please have your team secure all stations. We'll be setting up an emergency processing center for veterans documentation. The director looked at his watch. And contact the state director of transportation. I want them here within the hour. Military personnel we already moving through the office, placing markers on desks, photographing procedure manuals, and setting up equipment brought in from the vehicles. This facility will remain under Veterans Affairs Administration until further notice, Montgomery announced. All non-essential personnel are dismissed for the day. Essential supervisory staff will remain to assist with the transition. He looked directly at Karen. Ms. Wilcox, you'll stay. We have much to discuss about Veterans Services compliance. Montgomery turned back to Thomas, his tone softening. Now, Staff Sergeant, let's get you properly taken care of. I brought a mobile processing unit that can verify your identity through DoD and VA databases. We'll have your new license and credentials within 30 minutes. Thomas nodded gratefully. Thank you, sir, but this seems like an awful lot of trouble for one old Marine. The director smiled. No, Sergeant Henderson. The trouble began when one of our nation's heroes was denied the respect and accommodation he earned with his blood. We're just setting things right. Within minutes, the DMV had transformed. Military personnel had set up 3 mobile workstations, complete with advanced identification verification equipment. Director Montgomery led Thomas to the first station, where a technical specialist in uniform was already accessing secure databases. Sergeant Henderson's biometrics are in the system, Montgomery explained. His service record, medical history, and identification can all be verified through multiple federal databases. Karen watched from her desk, where she sat rigidly under the watchful eye of a stern-faced lieutenant. The state director of transportation had arrived, summoned from a dinner across town, and was now in deep conversation with Montgomery's chief of staff. The director addressed the remaining staff and customers. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to explain why this intervention was necessary. What happened here today represents a systemic failure in how we treat our veterans. He gestured toward Thomas, who was having his photograph taken for his new license. Staff Sergeant Henderson isn't just any veteran. After his reconnaissance unit was ambushed in the mountains of Afghanistan, he single-handedly established a defensive position that saved his entire platoon. Montgomery's voice filled with emotion. Despite sustaining severe injuries from an RPG explosion that left shrapnel throughout his lower body, Sergeant Henderson carried 2 wounded Marines over mountainous terrain to an evacuation point. Then, and this is the part that earned him the Purple Heart and Bronze Star with Valor, he returned under heavy fire to recover the body of his fallen radio operator, refusing to leave any Marine behind. Karen's face drained of color as the director continued. When his commanding officer arrived at the field hospital, he found Sergeant Henderson refusing pain medication until he had accounted for every member of his unit. The citation for his Purple Heart specifically mentions, and I quote, extraordinary courage under fire and selfless dedication to his fellow Marines beyond the call of duty. The director turned to face Karen directly. Ms. Wilcox, the man you dismissed today spent 2 years learning to walk again. The VA has every one of his records. His identity is verified at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Yet he was denied a simple accommodation guaranteed by both state and federal law. The state director approached. I want to personally apologize, Sergeant Henderson. This is unconscionable. It's not necessary, sir, Thomas replied quietly. I just needed my license. It is absolutely necessary, Montgomery countered. Staff Sergeant Henderson is featured in 3 different training modules at the Officer Candidate School. His tactical decisions under fire are studied by Marine Corps officers to this day. The technical specialist approached with a tablet. Sir, we've accessed Sergeant Henderson's complete service record and medical history. His identity is confirmed. We've also located his property records and insurance claim from the house fire. Montgomery nodded. Excellent. Process everything he needs. License, state ID, veteran's ID, and temporary documentation for his insurance and banking needs. He turned to the state director. As of this moment, I'm implementing a Veterans Priority Program at all state government offices. My staff will coordinate mandatory training for all personnel. Karen finally found her voice. Director, I was simply following established procedures for identification verification. I had no way of knowing. You were explicitly informed, Montgomery interrupted, holding up his tablet. I have here the record of 3 separate VA memos sent to this office regarding veterans accommodation procedures. All were marked as received and acknowledged by your office. Additionally, the training module on veterans services was assigned to your staff 6 months ago. Not a single employee here has completed it. The state director looked furious. Ms. Wilcox, this is a serious compliance failure. We'll be discussing your position in tomorrow's emergency meeting. Thomas, now holding his newly printed license and veteran's ID card, approached Karen. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet dignity. Ma'am, I don't want anyone to lose their job over this. That's not why I made the call. Director Montgomery shook his head. With respect, Sergeant, this isn't just about you. Our investigation has uncovered 17 similar incidents at this office in the past year alone. Veterans with proper documentation being turned away, unnecessary delays in processing military IDs, failure to implement mandated accommodations. He addressed everyone present. What happened today isn't an isolated incident. It represents a breakdown in how we honor our commitment to those who served. The technical specialist returned with an envelope containing Thomas's complete documentation package. All set, sir. Everything he needs, plus priority processing markers on all his accounts for the next 90 days to help with the fire recovery. Montgomery placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Sergeant Henderson never asked for special treatment. He simply deserved the respect and accommodation that our laws already guarantee. Today, we're making sure that happens, not just for him, but for every veteran who walks through these doors in the future. 1 week later, the local DMV bore little resemblance to the office where Thomas Henderson had stood ignored. A newly installed Veterans Priority Service sign hung prominently by the entrance. Every counter displayed the Veterans Affairs Service Commitment Pledge, and an electronic kiosk specifically for military service members had been installed. Karen Wilcox was no longer supervisor. Following the compliance audit, she'd been reassigned to the state's Veterans Services Training Division, a position Director Montgomery himself had suggested. Sometimes, he'd said, the best education comes from witnessing the consequences of indifference firsthand. Thomas returned to the DMV that morning, not for himself, but accompanying another veteran, a young woman who had lost a leg in Iraq. As they entered, the staff immediately recognized him. "Good morning, Sergeant Henderson." The new supervisor greeted them warmly. "Your friend will be helped right away." News of what had happened spread quickly through veteran communities. Many came forward with similar stories of bureaucratic obstacles they'd faced. The state director, still reeling from the public relations impact, established a Veterans Advocacy Office with a direct hotline to his department. Director Montgomery's intervention had grown into something larger than one man's driver's license. Within a month, 7 other states had implemented similar veterans' priority programs in their government offices. A national conversation about how America treats its veterans had been reignited. Thomas never sought attention for his role in these changes. When a local reporter asked for an interview, he simply said, "I didn't do anything special. I just made a phone call." The reporter persisted. "But do you feel vindicated after how you were treated?" Thomas considered this. "You know, I didn't serve my country for special treatment," he finally replied. "I served because it was my duty. All I ever wanted afterward was simple respect, not for me personally, but for what the uniform represents." He looked directly into the camera. "When we ignore the sacrifices of our veterans, we diminish the value of service itself." That young clerk didn't see me, she just saw an old man causing a delay. She forgot there's a story behind every veteran, often written in blood and sacrifice. The changes continued to spread. Federal guidelines for veteran services were strengthened, training became mandatory, and compliance audits more frequent. What had begun as one man's quiet stand for dignity had become a movement. Thomas kept the newspaper clipping about the incident in his wallet, not out of pride, but as a reminder that sometimes standing your ground quietly can move mountains. He never mentioned that Director Montgomery had offered him a consulting position with Veterans Affairs, a position he had accepted without hesitation. Some battles, Thomas knew, were fought not with weapons, but with patience, dignity, and a phone call to the right person. Share if you believe our veterans deserve our utmost respect and gratitude. They stood for us. We must stand for them.